Thanks, Penny, for that introduction. I'm not sure I recognise the person you were describing, but I'd like to also thank the Freilich Foundation and Dr. Renata Grossi for the invitation. I'm really very honoured to be here to speak today. So like Penny, I'd like to preface my lecture by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, but particularly by acknowledging what that phrase hints at, but doesn't make explicit. That is the meeting here and now of Indigenous and non-Indigenous laws. Both of these laws continue to exist, but that existence is often repressed, in large part by calling one of those laws traditional and the other one simply law. I'll return to that question shortly, but I wanted to begin by going back to an essay written by the namesake of this lecture, Professor Alice Tay, at the turn of the 21st century. Professor Tay's article, called The New Century, Globalisation and Human Rights, is striking for its evocation of a particular millennial mood. So I don't feel that old, but it is nice to be in front of a room full of people who remember 1989, because most of my students were infants at the time. But 1989 was, of course, the year in which a lone man stood in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square, in which the suppression of a peaceful demonstration in Prague led to a velvet revolution, and in which the opening of checkpoints between East and West Berlin, allowing free movement across the city, quickly led to the rich symbolism of the act of German people dismantling the Berlin Wall brick by brick. Unpleasant regimes in the Third World, held in place by Cold War alliances with the First and Second Worlds, started to feel the pressures of resistance too. Even at the time, I remember, for me, it was my first year of university, it felt like a momentous year. And auguries were quickly read into the events. Then President of the United States, George Bush Sr., remember him, soon prophesied the birth of a new world order. Others, of course, famously suggested that not only had the ideological struggle between liberal capitalist democracy and state-sponsored capitalism ended, but so had history itself. In Fukuyama's words, what we were seeing, quote, was the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalisation of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. I think he's since eaten those words, but anyway. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the triumph were grossly exaggerated. Just like the fate of the unknown man in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, the outcome of the Cold War's conclusion was not so easy to discern. Soon, progressives in the West were talking about American empire, the race to the bottom, and the winners and losers in the seemingly inevitable process of globalisation. By 1999, it had become clear that unchecked by the spectre of a rival ideology, liberal democracy had quickly morphed into neoliberal capitalism. Indeed, it was in that same year, in capitalism's heartland, that 40,000 protesters united under the slogan, "Our world is not for sale," in demonstrations organised to coincide with a new round of global trade talks at an institution which had come to symbolise a particular kind of ideology, and that ideology was the prioritisation of the economy over the polity. This infamous battle in Seattle provides Professor Tay's essay with its opening line. Poised between the popular protests of December 1999 and the much more violent events which we now know were yet to come, Professor Tay paints a portrait of the world significantly more sober than the triumphal millenarianism which followed the fall of the wall and the First Iraq War. But yet when I revisited this essay, or this telling evocation of the millennial mood, two things struck me. The first was the optimism, albeit subdued, of the possibility for a genuinely universal ethical stance which seemed to have become available to international law and institutions. Like many others, Professor Tay expressed optimism about the possibility for the vision embodied in the founding documents of contemporary international law finally to serve as the ethical compass by which globalisation could become the means to a better end. That ethical compass sat securely in the economic system of liberal capitalism. Professor Tay writes, We have the unprecedented opportunity to take the growth and interdependence of the global economy and use it to secure the peace, well-being and progress of the global society. Key amongst the mechanisms likely to achieve this were, of course, human rights. Like many other eminent minds of the time, Professor Tay expressed the hope that by forging a partnership between business and civil society articulated in the language of rights, the benefits of globalisation could be universally shared. This is the mood that at the international institutional level led to talk of convergence, harmonisation and constitutionalisation, remember? The second thing which struck me about this millennial mood was the place of the environment. So the problem of the environment was presented as pressing and important, but it was presented as a phase 2 issue. So it seemed to be relatively discrete, governed by its own specialist expertise and crucially able to be tackled later when development had done its work. In both of these qualities, the tone of the essay exemplifies the institutional mood of the period. Then, and for some time afterwards, in assessments from Secretaries General to professors to NGOs, it seemed plausible, if idealistic, that the best course of action would be for the world to build consensus around the meaning of the proper way to organise societies everywhere and to operationalise that vision. Within reach, seen for the first time was the possibility of finding a proper relation to each other, of sharing a particular relation to universality. Familiar as well with the diagnosis of environmental problems capable of being addressed by improved technologies and being cleaned up. Okay, that's the millennial mood. Fast forward 22 years later to the current Secretary General's 5-year action agenda, published on the 25th of January this year. Compared with the cautious optimism visible at the dawn of the new millennium, we now see a strikingly different mood, unstable and divided and distinctly more political than before. The currents of change, writes Ban Ki-moon, are now seen to be transforming our human and physical geography, accelerating inequality within and across nations, producing challenges to the existing social contract by a disillusioned, mobilised citizenry. Technological and organisational transformation, he writes, are no longer seen as vehicles which will speed the creation of one harmonious world, but instead as, quote, linking people directly as never before, and along with climate change, placing the foundations of our world and our global system under unprecedented stress. And yet, while the mood and the diagnosis seem quite different, the prescription when it comes looks surprisingly like more of the same. More integration, more consolidation, more global consensus about a common vision for a common future. But this time, what it would take to actualise a particular kind of universality or to bring it into being is thrown into much sharper relief. Agreeing on, quote, a common vision for the future also requires an institutional architecture and international systems not so much to create a safety net for the losers of globalisation, but as a matter of security, to deal with the increasing politicisation of those erstwhile victims, to, quote, manage unprecedented threats and demand for change. In my provocation today, I'll suggest that if we are to redirect ourselves away from a dystopic future of social stratification and scarcity and the conflict, violence and suffering that implies, it seems clear that we need to think about how we might address simultaneously the great challenges of our time to which Ban Ki-moon alludes. For me, the two most significant of those challenges are increasing global inequality and the fact that we are living well beyond the biophysical carrying capacity of the Earth. But instead of approaches which would, in essence, disaggregate the causes of the problem and aggregate the solutions, I will suggest that we need to reverse that characterisation. That is, to conceptualise the problems as highly aggregated or systemic and to pluralise the repertoire of approaches on which we draw to try and address them. The ever closer integration urged by the Secretary-General between development, security, human rights and humanitarian action will, in my argument, not enable us to address growing inequality in the context of the Earth's limits. And perhaps most significantly for this audience, such integrated solutions will drain the political lifeblood from the concept of human rights. Because if we locate them in their historical context, we can see that these contemporary projects of integration, harmonisation, convergence and constitutionalisation on a global scale are a modern legacy of imperialism. This is a legacy underpinned by an idea of the world's unity expressed in the concept of development. In material terms, that unity, or that legacy, I should say, is felt most acutely in the double challenge I want to focus on today: global inequality and the question of limits. In light of this, I'm going to invite this audience to ask whether honouring the promise of human rights means insisting on their untidy, unbureaucratic, resistant political dimension, and resisting what I think of as the temptations of influence offered by the project of globalising human rights through their incorporation into the development project. And I will invite you to consider how to mobilise the ethical and political promise of human rights, promise of justice and dignity, which gives breath to human rights, in order to find, recover or invent lawful and peaceful modes of encounter between human rights and its rivals, including rival universals and rival expressions of dignity. Okay, so to offer this invitation to thought, I'm going to give you a short historical account of the ideas and institutions of development and its turn to rights and its environmental effects. I'll then tell you a story about a struggle happening today in India which illustrates the dilemmas of fostering an intimacy between development and human rights. And I'll offer a way to reread that story which raises the question about what it might mean to honour the promise of dignity which human rights makes in our own practice as scholars, lawyers, activists, development workers, officials or citizens of somewhere. Okay, sorry, I just need to get some product. Okay, so development emerged in something like its current institutional form in the late 1940s, from the lineaments of the shift from European to American power and the beginning of the Cold War. At that moment, the end of the Second World War, the success of independence struggles and the fatigue of empire meant that former colonies were increasingly decolonising. Colonialism, of course, was not outlawed by the UN Charter, but after the Holocaust, race became untenable as an explicit principle around which the new international institutions could be organised. This is, of course, reflected in the Nuremberg trials and in the UDHR. Imperialism, however, was specifically not defined as a racially discriminatory structure of rule per se. Indeed, many historians, such as Mark Mazower, argue that what was meant to come out of those talks for many was an imperial internationalism. But independence fighters in the colonies took up the putative universality of the promise of equality and pushed it far beyond the drafters' original intentions. But, flip back from the emancipatory to the imperial, during the imperial period, European public law had spread over the globe, becoming international law, displacing other laws of encounter that had operated between other regimes. We might call them rival international laws, and displaced them as it moved. That displacement meant that when the institutions, contemporary institutions of international law were formed, the European nation-state held a monopoly over legal personality. Indeed, as James Crawford has pointed out, it was in the UN Charter that the nation-state became, for the first time, a protected category. So after 1945 or so, the only way to enter the world and to take a place in it was as a nation-state. In other words, former colonies could only decolonise through self-determination as a nation-state, and that too within the former colonial boundaries expressed in the doctrine of uti possidetis. But, flip again, even as the juridical form of nation-statehood channelled the outcomes of decolonisation, The changing complexion, we might call it, of the international community in the 1950s and 60s confronted the identity of the international community with difference. These newly emerging states presented a challenge to the universal claim of the categories of international law. So the fact that the nation state had covered the globe was really an outcome of imperial geography. The fact that the idea of law, properly so-called, could only be claimed by European public law, and the fact that that was a hierarchy, that operated on a hierarchy secured by racial difference was potentially revealed by decolonisation. But also the simple differences of fact in the societies, polities, economies, etc. made it clear that the universal categories of the European nation state were not universal in fact. It became clear then that these categories, that universality was normative, not factual. So universality was defined then as, we can define it as generally applicable or rightfully generalisable. In other words, universality was not ontological, it was jurisdictional. So, decolonisation potentially revealed that the meaning of universality was defined by reference to European jurisdictional forms, and that the particular categories being elevated to that status rested on the same idea of European superiority that had underpinned empire. In the soil of that challenge, development grew from seed largely planted by an afterthought in the inaugural address of American President Harry Truman in 1947. Using the ideas of development and underdevelopment in a novel way, as encapsulating somehow the human condition, Truman's conceptualisation offered a way to understand difference. And essentially, that way of understanding difference was to temporalise it. The present of some became the future of others. Because difference was organised temporally, formal equality could be maintained as a normative principle. As Ashish Nandi puts it, we were all the same, except that some of us had been caught in a time warp. So, in other words, in the family of man, we are all brothers, but some of us are underdeveloped or younger or less mature than others. In terms of international law, seeing difference through the lens of development provided a way to maintain the universal claim and asserted objectivity of the categories of international law in the face of this radical difference. Okay, so the way this maintenance was effected, though, was by securing this temporalisation of difference and the values being put forth as universal in a new hierarchy. This hierarchy was actualised by the new technologies of gross domestic product and national accounting, which were also both invented at the same time as development by Simon Kuznets. Okay, so as a number, GDP, whether intentionally or not, provided a scientific-looking rationalisation for the United States in its position as the world's most powerful nation. So even with the realisation of the promise of formal sovereign equality, nation-states could still be ordered in a hierarchy, but with GDP instead of race as the securing value. You with me? Okay, so what made this particular ladder so attractive was that it seemed to throw out the idea of racial difference, which was both humiliating and unchangeable, and replace it structurally with a promise that states at the bottom were included within the bosom of the international community and set on a path toward joining the ranks of the chosen few developed states at the top. Making good the promise was a technical challenge identifiable not through the civilizational tropes of race and culture, but through the growth of the economy. It was even measurable through the new technology of the GDP. So instead of the old stasis of race and the slow progress envisaged in the Enlightenment narrative of universal history, in which some people were simply caught in the past, in this new story, man, specifically American man, could speed up the course of history through the application of technology. And because, as we see in the seeds of that Truman Address in 1947, because the poverty of the miserable was perceived as a threat to the security of all, the promise secured a project which was legitimately the concern of all nations. And so development from its inception was an international project. Okay, so taking root in the soil of much older patterns of thought and nourished by shifts in global power, development as a way to order the world quickly hit the zeitgeist. It quickly became the primary idiom in which demands for greater material equality were issued, both by developing and developed states and on both sides of the ideological divide. And indeed, since about the 1950s, the modern concept of development has really become a proxy for the way we talk about the question of material need or human flourishing. Think about how this remains true to the present day. When we talk about the persistence of global poverty, the solution is still development. Collective efforts to reduce hunger, reduce maternal and infant mortality, to empower women, to increase primary education are called the Millennium Development Goals. Trade negotiation rounds which focus on poor countries are called the development rounds. Development seems to be completely interchangeable with the idea of human flourishing. Even international military interventions have been recast as development problems. Money spent on security and post-war reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, are both accounted for in terms of development spending. So this equivalence has been remarkably resilient, even in the face of its poor record, because despite more than 60 years of development, the proliferation of a huge international bureaucracy and thousands of NGOs dedicated to bringing an end to poverty, the gains have been modest at best. Using the institution's own terms, which hinge on monetary income-based measures of poverty, recent World Bank statistics suggest that half the world's people, live on less than $2.50 a day, and many people survive on far less than that. The World Bank's own statistics regarding improvements on various indicators show, though, that if we exclude the clear decline in income poverty in China, then the percentage of people living below $2.50 a day has basically flatlined. See? That's the figure excluding China. And actually, states which have raised the standard of living of their general populations have often primarily done so by ignoring the prescriptions of international development institutions. This failure is especially marked given that the world economy has increased sixfold over the past 50 years. Can you see if I'm standing here? Is anybody blocked? Okay. So over this time, not only has the world become much richer, but a huge international bureaucracy has proliferated, specifically charged with the task of alleviating poverty. Some estimates, such as William Easterly's in 2007, estimate that over $2.3 trillion have been spent on foreign aid over the last 5 decades. But of course, over the same period, inequality has also increased significantly within and between nations. In the article with which I began, Professor Tay points out that the gap between the richest and poorest nations between 1950 and 1980 had doubled from 30-1 to 60-1. In regional terms, the ratio of per capita income in Europe, from Europe to Africa, for example, went from 30-1 in 1960 to 40-1 in 2005. And on an individualised level, just one example about the way that the gap between rich and poor is going is that the richest 450 individuals in the world, now possess more wealth than the poorest 415 million combined. Plotting the distribution of wealth on a graph produces what is referred to without irony as the champagne glass effect. Okay, so the human rights movement as a legal and institutional phenomenon, though not necessarily as a political phenomenon, has also come to accept development as a proxy for how we understand a conception of human well-being. So both the means and the end. Indeed, human rights has contributed to the dominance of the development paradigm in 2 ways in this regard. Okay, first, human rights is often used to explain why rich countries should care about poor countries. Human rights is often the legal, moral and security language of why rich countries should spend more money on development. In each of those idioms, the justification relies explicitly on development. as the solution to global poverty. Some people have, of course, tried to push this even further by institutionalising a right to development. And whilst that initiative has really gained not so much traction in institutional terms, it's a very good example of the way that the concepts of human rights and development together have captured the imaginative domain of institutional and state-based approaches to global poverty in both the North and the South. Second, over the same period, human rights have been used to try and refine the meaning of development, to combine social and political goods with the more orthodox notion of economic growth. We can think of this as an ameliorative relation between human rights and development. So in this ameliorative vein, human rights activists have also tried to turn to human rights to try and soften the development process, to broaden the definition of beyond economic growth to include other intangible human goods, to accord procedural rights against the state as it carries out the project of development, to sensitise development to women, etc., etc. Together, these moves have cumulatively resulted in the relatively widespread adoption of what is called the rights-based approach to development. Now, typically, the expansion of development and its convergence with human rights is understood as a good thing. Many good people expend much energy in an effort to expand the reach, coherence and mutual enforcement of these two regimes. But as they are currently understood, in my argument, a merger between development and human rights is not capable of addressing growing inequality within the Earth's limits for two main reasons. First, because of the central ordering position given to the idea of economic growth in holding together the picture of the world that the development story relies on, growth has proven impossible to dislodge from what I call the secret beating heart of the development project. So while it's true that human rights approaches have been critical of the trickle-down approach to poverty alleviation, and whilst it's true that they've been used to try to address the dislocations caused by the development project and the increases in inequality that have accompanied growth, they still rely on growth as the engine of development. Even Amartya Sen's idea of development as freedom, for example, ultimately relies on economic growth as the principal driver of prosperity. Because of the shared goal of development, institutionalised human rights in this context have necessarily been interpreted in ways that accept the ideology that a growth-based approach to development assumes. And since the end of the Cold War, that has also meant leaving the expansion of the market fundamentally unchallenged. And you often find that when people try to expand goods to the poor, they often talk about access to markets in food, access to markets. So the ideology of the market is left whole, even though people are trying to soften it. So the centrality of economic growth to the idea of development, and as a key measure of the relative health of a nation state in both the developed and developing worlds alike, has led us to the place we're in today. This is a vantage point from which we can't avoid seeing that we're already using too many of the world's resources and too quickly. Many of you will already be familiar with these facts. It suggests that the Earth is groaning under the weight of the demands that we're making of it, and not only as a source for what sustains us, but as a sink for what we dispose of. I wanted to just show you an image, which we could call an image of development. That's from an artist called Chris Jordan. It's worth Googling him just to see the art he makes from waste. That's a picture of one of the world's largest rubbish dumps in Brazil. You can see how enormous it is. It overshadows well, it's not a very clear picture, but it overshadows the town down there. Okay, so this is true not only in terms of carbon emissions, which we're all talking about, but also in terms of many other factors, including chemical pollutants and biodiversity loss. So this slide shows us that in those yellow triangles, those are the areas in which we're bypassing the safe limits of the Earth, which is represented by that green line, and in ocean acidification, for example, and other areas we're approaching that red line. And these unshaded areas are unquantified yet. So I'm not sure where the yellow triangle would be there. So this has led some people to describe the period since the 1950s as the Great Acceleration. This is just a slide that's quite interesting because it tracks a bunch of things like foreign direct investment, but also McDonald's restaurants and paper consumption, just to show how since 1950 there's been an acceleration of use of everything, basically. Use and waste. So this idea of consuming too much too fast is of course expressed neatly in the idea of how many planets we're using. So by this measure, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the fact that we're using around 1.5 planets. In other words, because of the differential patterns of consumption in the rich and poor worlds, if everyone lived like the proverbial Aussie battler, not a rich Australian, we would need approximately 5 planets to sustain the current population of the Earth. Described in a different way, the Earth could keep around 1.8 billion people living at the current consumption levels of an average to poor person in a rich country, high-income country, as opposed to the almost 7 billion we have with vastly disparate levels of consumption. These facts make it difficult to reconcile the promise of development with the environmental impossibility of its realisation. Now, I can hear you all saying to me, sustainable development, sustainable development. So the implications of this have, of course, been recognised in the turn of institutions to sustainable development. And I don't have time to go through that in detail, and I know there are people in the room who know the field much better than me. But even on its own terms, a close study of the premises upon which sustainable development relies, essentially that's green growth, technology, clean up afterwards, and inclusivity through ideas such as pro-poor growth, sustainable development is at best capable of producing less unsustainable development. Reading the World Bank's latest report on inclusive green growth, which is a pretty good account of the state of the art, it's clear that even if it were operationalised tomorrow, so even if you could get over the political will problem, the best you would get in environmental terms, as Donella Meadows famously put it, is that things would get worse more slowly. Now, whilst that may not be a bad thing in itself, slowing down our run to the edge of the cliff is always good. Sustainable development is also profoundly depoliticising because it provides a way to deal rhetorically with the contradiction between the development prescription of increased consumption-based growth and the impossibility of making good that promise when we're already using more of the Earth's resources than can be sustained. Any study of institutional and political practice shows us that the discourse of sustainable development has diverted energies away from the urgent need to recognise the implications of the rapid depletion of the Earth's resources for a growth-based economic model. And that's not just climate change, but the other things I showed you in the slide of water scarcity, biodiversity loss, etc. The idea of clean-up or the replacement of the losses by technology afterwards, or even the idea that we fully understand what's being lost, is, according to the best available science, a fantasy, except maybe in relation to very local cases of ambient pollution. The Secretary-General's 5-year agenda, which I mentioned earlier, is a very good example of the tragic paradox, the mismatch between promise and possibility this creates. So think back to that document, or go and Google it when you leave the room. Its first of 5 action points is sustainable development, urging progress toward the Millennium Development Goals on one hand, implicitly relying on growth-led development. But this is followed by several other points directed at addressing the growing challenges produced by the environmental degradation, natural disasters, climate change and explosive urbanisation that this model of development has and will continue to produce. And although those challenges are couched in the language of opportunity and presented as a rallying call, the tragic paradox between prescription and cure seems to haunt the Secretary-General's remarks in quite a striking way. Okay, so the second reason why a merger between development and rights prevents us from thinking about inequality and limits at the same time is that, as well as centering on economic growth as a solution to the problem of poverty, human rights, as they find expression in the development paradigm, participate in the knowledge structure of development, in which rival traditions, rival ways of life, which organise the relation between people and their environment differently than consumption-based growth, and the rival laws which order those ways of life are downgraded through the technology of temporalization to custom or tradition. Think about the acknowledgement of the traditional owners with which I began. Positioned in this way, such rival laws and the forms of relation they support are vulnerable to the figurative tide of a putatively universal history, in which they may legitimately be sacrificed. In this sacrifice, justice may be served, it seems, by a chain of substitutions in which their destruction is reconciled with conscience through compensation. Okay, so this point is well illustrated in a situation that I have begun very recently to research, though some of you may already be familiar with it, of a battle being fought in the hills of Orissa, Odisha, in the east of India between a group of several tribes of people called the Kond, a phalanx of mining companies and smaller independent operators profiting from the so-called mineral boom, the Indian nation state, various provincial governments, including the state of Orissa. So the Kond live in and around the Nyamgiri Hills, but their story can really be repeated all over East India, where Indigenous people, not to mention peasants, and mineral extraction are meeting head to head. That's the area I'm talking about. See, it's quite a big area. Okay. It's a familiar story too in many other countries in the world. One group, the Dongria Kond, is involved in a particularly high-profile struggle. The Dongria call themselves the Jania, that's my shoe, meaning protectors of streams, because they safeguard their sacred mountain, Nyam Dongar, and the rivers that rise within its forests. The sacred mountain is known to the Dongria people as the Mountain of Law. That's a picture of the Mountain of Law. Unfortunately, in around 1998, bauxite was discovered in the Nyamgiri Hills, and not long afterwards, negotiations began toward a memorandum of understanding between the Anglo-Indian mining giant Vedanta Resources, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, and the government of Orissa to construct a refinery, power plant and bauxite mining operation. The refinery was to be in the valley, the mine was to be on top of the mountain. So to cut a very interesting story very short, since that time the Dongria have been fighting the company as well as the provincial and national governments. Since the MOU was signed, forests and villages have been cleared, both legally and illegally, and many people have been subject to violent beatings and threats, allegedly at the hands of both the company and the state. In theory, of course, both the forests and the Dongria Kond are protected by national laws, including the Constitution. Protest and advocacy have accompanied each step of this story, and I was going to show you a short musical interlude video, but I think I'll run out of time if I show you. Maybe I'll show you at the end if I have enough time. So basically, the refinery was built with very toxic health and environmental outcomes for those who live nearby. The battle continued in relation to the proposed mine and the six-fold expansion of the refinery. At one point, approval was given to one part of the project referred to as a forest diversion proposal in Nyamgiri on condition that a special purpose vehicle be set up and that the company contribute several $1 million to a fund for tribal development. And upon hearing the news of this approval with the fund, the Dongria promised to defend their homes with their lives. They blocked the road to the site with tree trunks and held banners saying, "We are Dongria Kond. Vedanta cannot take our mountain." Oh, that was the red pond. That's the toxic waste from the refinery that's been seeping into the river and the groundwater. So more protests marked the unfolding approvals process, including blockades of the roads into the forests by the Dongria in December 2008, a 7,000-person march of protesters to the gates of the refinery in 2009, and on January 27, 2009, over 10,000 men, women and children formed a 17-kilometre-long human chain around Nyamgiri mountain. People in the chain held signs saying, "Nyamgiri is Dongria land. Vedanta cannot come here without our permission. We say no." Over the next year, between 2009 and 10, a battle ensued in which allegedly bogus public hearings were held and a huge PR campaign by Vedanta happened, including a completely bizarre film competition called Creating Happiness about filming Vedanta projects in rural India. International involvement also grew, including an amnesty mission to the Nyamgiri Hills and protests at Vedanta by people dressed as Na'vi, the fictional aliens from the movie Avatar. So, whilst the joint venture was clearing more hurdles in the approval process, final forest clearance was still outstanding. Violent clashes were occurring and the Indian government began its slide toward Operation Green Hunt, which is the name that the journalists or the media have given the Indian government's paramilitary operations against the Naxalites along the so-called Red Corridor, which crosses 5 states and covers all areas where Indigenous people and peasants live their lives on mineral-rich soil. So in the media and by the government, this is referred to as the Maoist Corridor, and Arundhati Roy says it should more accurately be called the MOU, MUist, Memorandum of Understanding, MUist Corridor. Sorry, it doesn't work unless you see it written down. So, despite the engagement of the discourse of anti-terrorism by the Indian state, the seemingly miraculous happened, and the then Minister of Environment, who was moved afterwards, Jairam Ramesh, on the advice of a panel he set up, recommended that the mine and the 6-fold expansion of the refinery be blocked, saying that Vedanta had acted illegally and in contempt for the law. The High Court of Orissa upheld that decision in July 2011. Vedanta appealed to the High Court of India. That court was due to hand down its decision on the 9th of April this year, but as yet no decision has been reached. In August, just now, Vedanta reported suffering bauxite shortages because it wasn't able to mine next to the refinery as it had planned. And in September, Vedanta announced that in December it would close the refinery. Now, it's hard to know if this is the victory that some people are saying it is in the David and Goliath battle, or whether it's a strategy by Vedanta to try and pressure the government into granting the forest clearance. So this is still very new work for me, and I'm not an Indian constitutional lawyer, so I'm sure I've misconstrued some of the fine-grained elements of the story. But despite that, I think it's a very good illustration of the point that I'm trying to make about the way that the merger between development and human rights allows sacrifice in the name of growth. Partnered with development, human rights becomes ameliorative at best, sapped of political breath, and severed from the relation to plural forms of human dignity to which it aspires. In large measure, this is because, from the developmental mindset, Indigenous people have no law of their own. They have only culture, which is where traditional law is located, and universal human rights. So the position taken by the company is that its actions are justified by its contribution to economic growth and by bringing development to the underdeveloped. The chairman of Vedanta has said on several occasions that he wants to, quote, bring tribals into the mainstream. Of course, he doesn't specify that this means mainstream poverty, nor that the roads being built in the Nyamgiri Hills and surrounds are for trucks carrying bauxite and spewing toxic dust, not for children to walk to school. The mining is justified too, as it always is, by the promise of hospitals and schools, roads and technology. That promise has enormous imaginative appeal to the young Indian elites as they see themselves as the new bearers of the development promise. The Indian state, of course, is the primary bearer of that promise. Since the modern state of India, like all developing states, was born with economic development at its heart, it is legitimate within national and international law to espouse a discourse in which some people must be sacrificed for the good of the national economy. This was initially about state-led industrialisation, but translates in the post-1989 period largely as the need to protect private investment. This is imbricated with the discourse of international security, but because economic growth is the secret beating heart of the developmental state, human security is subordinated to the security of the economy. An indicative quote, I think. When you consider the backstory to the left-wing extremism. In this story, it is the primary duty of the state to bring about development. The dimension of democratic state accountability then subsists in process, largely in the idioms of consent and consultation, participation and inclusivity. Okay, but even if actually consent is withheld, the path taken quite legitimately is forcible removal with resettlement and compensation. And that serves the processual demand. That's expressed most succinctly, I think, in the new development mantra of inclusive growth. Okay, so the position taken by one group of international human rights NGOs in this struggle, and the one most resonant with most of the progressive international response, tries to hold the state to account in a similar idiom. This position tries to gain traction against the mining companies through various rights-based strategies like process rights like full prior and informed consent, the right to compensation for forcible relocation, property rights through land titling, etc., etc. And to keep the mining at bay itself, it tries to use the idea of a right to a clean and healthy environment. Much of this is illustrated by the very, very compelling Amnesty report on this particular struggle. But the difficulty with this position and its salience for thinking through what it might mean for those who organise both their conscience and their political profession, and their professional life around the idea of human dignity, is well illustrated by an exhibition I saw recently at the Brunei Gallery at SOAS in London. So this was an exhibition of a photographic essay by a guy called Robert Wallace that was tracking a struggle very similar to the one that I've described, but this time it was in Jharkhand rather than the Amgiri Hills. Next to a photo of a mine encroaching on a village was a quote from, where is that quote? I'll just have to read it out to you, sorry. Now I can, so much for my high-tech presentation. Can somebody get rid of that? Will you get rid of it? Don't worry, I'll get rid of it. Because the screen's gone down. Hang on. That's all right. That's fine. Okay, so the quote said, this was from the former personnel manager of the Parij coal mine. He says, quote, "I have always allowed them to demolish their own house in their own time with dignity. Many times I've gone to give them their compensation cheque and they've sat in front of their house weeping with my cheque in their hands. Now I've been demoted by the company because I show too much compassion." The point of this story is that for the guy in the coal mine, this was a real ethical dilemma to which he was offering a real ethical response. He suffered because of his compassion, but the way that he enacted his ethical impulse was the only way he could in the position he was in, which was to allow people to take their houses apart themselves rather than the bulldozer, which is what his colleagues were doing, which is why this guy got demoted. But for me, that quote encapsulated the difficulties of a human rights-based approach to development. Because for the international human rights lawyer, who in the context of the development project, you end up with amelioration, development with a kinder face, clean mining. But although the ethical impulse is real, very real, the human rights lawyers, this guy's responsibility for participating in the authorisation of the mining and displacement is absolved by the developmentalism underpinning the project. In that story, the tide of history would in any case wash away the tribal way of life so that the human rights lawyer's role becomes palliative, one for caring for the transition of a dying way of life and as a midwife for the arrival of modernity. But in contrast to all three of these positions, nearly finished. From the perspective of the Indigenous people, the position is clear. It represents a violent clash of laws. According to the Guardian newspaper, just before the Supreme Court was due to hand down its decision, Kuminthi Marji, a leader of the Marji Kon, the Adivasis, said that local communities would stop the mining, quote, whether or not the Supreme Court favour us. We, the Marj Kon Adivasis, will help our Dongria Kon brothers in protecting the mountains, the paper quoted Marji as saying. As Arundhati Roy has written so beautifully in Broken Republic, for the Dongria, the mountain is a mountain of law. In this, she acknowledges the explicitly sacred ground of Kon law without ceding the ground of law itself. The mountain, she writes, is full of law and gods. This way of thinking allows us to observe the technologies of classification practiced in modern law, which would draw definitional lines between the secular and the sacred without getting drawn back into their universalising logic. Thinking about this story in a different way, one which rejects development as the explanatory myth of our time or as the encapsulation of our human condition, thus reveals a meeting of laws. This offers the person who organises their conscience and their professional life around the struggle for dignity two things. First, it enables us to hear Indigenous law as law, which other forms of engagement do not. But because of hearing that, it asks us to take responsibility for the practices of our own conduct as jurists or as activists in authorising what's going on. So, to put it simply, in some traditions of law, including the common law Anglo-Australian tradition, human rights is an important tradition of dignity, or important language of dignity. In other traditions of law, it is not. But the world is structured in political economic terms in ways which give significant incentives for people to try and articulate their demands for human dignity in the language of rights. This is a language of dignity drawn from the tradition of law which became dominant through empire and whose continued dominance is imperialism's legacy. Although using that language doesn't guarantee success, we know that it may facilitate audibility. And the consequences of rejecting that language are high. But as suggested by the increasing politicisation and sometimes violence of those who are, quote, demanding change, the price of audibility may be higher still. When development and human rights converge, modes of law and life and expressions of dignity which cannot take shape within those structures of economy and political organisation which are the legacies of empire are precluded from being aired in a space of lawful engagement. Those who choose to use a different language of dignity or insist on their own laws are labelled ignorant, backwards, underdeveloped, outlaws, or even terrorists. Instead of asking how we can change the world by institutionalising one historical tradition of dignity, perhaps our commitment to dignity demands that we should ask what this implies for our own conduct as people who belong to a particular cosmology and are trained in a particular tradition. In order to engage peacefully with those traditions which express dignity in different institutional forms, must we continue to demand that they adopt our language? Or could we think about how, in coming from one tradition, we could find ways to meet those from other traditions lawfully, including those with whom we do not share a cosmology, philosophy, or community in common? Thank you.